Perhaps you, like many of us, have been thinking about Linkin Park a lot recently. You know, the voice of the soundtrack of so many classic moments in CS, thanks to all the Frag movies. Maybe you've been going back, re-listening to some of the old tracks from the first couple of albums. It probably had you crawling in your skin, remembering all those great moments that have been and gone. But if you want to break the habit of being less than you could be as a player, if you no longer want to feel numb or like you tried so hard, but in the end it didn't even matter, maybe check out Boomio, where they have guides and services to help you improve as a player, because they have major winners as their points of authority. They've got Shocks, they've got Device, they've got Fallen. And with their guides there, all the theory that's there, it's very much a place for your head. And, you know, personally, I think if you want to improve, you've got to apply kind of a hybrid theory of you've got the practical elements, you go into the duels mod, you go into pre-fire mod, you've got the theoretical approach where you watch guides, where you think about the game, you talk about people on the forums, and you watch the best players. And that's how you improve as a player. So Gambit, the CIS squad, have won the 11th CSGO major, PGL Krakow. In doing so, we had all these storylines fulfilled. First of all, that is the first time in history a CIS squad has ever won the major. Obviously, Na'Vi made it close, getting a couple of finals. It's the first major for a couple of historic players. Zeus had never won a CSGO major. He'd been in those finals with Na'Vi. He'd been in numerous top 4s, top 8s, but never won the major. It was one of my top 20 players never to win the major. I think he was actually 20th. Let me think. Oh no, maybe he was 10th actually. Yeah, I think he might have been 10th. I'll link that piece down there in the description box below. Another player on there, Dosia, obviously one of the beasts of the early first year and a half of CSGO. Also hadn't won a major. Looked very much like he was never going to, because he's not a star player anymore. So two very fulfilling storylines there. Interestingly enough, Zeus had won majors in 1.6. He won 4 in a row, in fact, from the beginning of 2010 to early 2011 with Na'Vi. So overall, he won 5 majors across his illustrious Counter-Strike career, and majors in 2 different games now. Very impressive, you have to go ahead and say. Then you've got to consider that 3 of the players who won this major were from Kazakhstan. Now, even within the CIS region, Kazakhstan's not a region that's had much success. Their only real notable success was having silver medal finish at the World Cyber Games in 2005, which was a major, but it was the year that they used Source, and so not a lot of people looked at that as a very legit one. A lot of the top teams weren't at that tournament because they allowed teams to qualify in 1.6, but then go to the tournament and play Source, so it wasn't a very high-level tournament. And yes, Adren was in that team back then, but no one really looks at that as a great accomplishment. It's not the same as a 1.6 major, and certainly not the same as a CSGO major. So amazing to think that 3 players from Kazakhstan have managed to win a major at this point in time before, you know, an entire team from Ukraine or Russia, etc. And obviously no one from NA has done it so far. Now then, coming into the major, Gambit would not have been anyone's pick to win the major. Like, I don't know any expert who would have had them even top 4 as a pick to win the major, because they weren't in great form. Like, first of all, you look at the players. Now, their best player this year, by far, has been Adren. He's had fantastic numbers, very dominant fragging, very consistent, and he's been fantastic in the clutch. The problem is, the couple of months leading into the major actually was when he was having a little bit of a downturn. He wasn't quite as crazy in terms of pure fragging, wasn't as effective in the clutch. He was still a very good player, but he wasn't at the same level. And since he was the primary star of their team, that is something that neutered some of their firepower. Now, Hobbit has been the really consistent find in the team, because he's had good fragging, and it's incredibly consistent tournament to tournament. Like, he wasn't, obviously when he won DreamHack Winter, it wasn't a huge tournament, but he was the MVP of that tournament. He's never going to be the main star of the team, but he's a very good second star in the context of a team that, you know, was in the bottom half of the top 10. Certainly one of the better players in that respect of his peers at the time. Their problem is, Mo, as an AWPer, his entire career, and up to this major, was continually just farming the tier 2 tournaments and teams, and then playing the big teams and tournaments and not doing that well. So he was always kind of the missing X factor that was never there for them in the big tournaments before, hence why they didn't make really deep runs in the tier 1 tournaments. And then Dosia, yes, he had that one performance at DreamHack Austin, like a real throwback to 2014, 2013, but beyond that, nothing. And in fact, his fragging, quite poor. Then you've got to consider, he's not a very supportive player, and he's not a very cerebral player. So while he might fit with Zeus, they're both veterans of the scene, I don't feel as though Dosia was giving them a whole lot. So actually firepower was a big issue for this team. Now, one thing that had improved is earlier in the year, coming up to like Star Series, they were just a 2-map team. They were a team that was incredibly good on Cobble and Overpass. That was it, though. If you got them off those maps, they lost the majority of the time. Now, what they've improved since then is they have massively improved their map pool. And coming into this major, it was already improved. They'd already crucially gotten Inferno and Train to a very good level, where actually they were kind of like a sleeper pick to get wins against top teams on those maps. And crucially, those are 2 maps that no one's really a total god at, particularly Inferno. It's very much played and it's very much undecided. Now, the key is that, yes, they're still very good on Cobble, but they tend to use that as bait in the pick ban. And Overpass was a map that, for whatever reason, they just weren't playing because, again, teams were scared of those maps. Now, interestingly enough, their nuke actually had gotten surprising. They'd gotten some upset wins there, including just a narrow loss to G2, the best team on nuke. And their cash actually was decent considering it's a map Zeus never played. So the map veto wasn't bad. It's just that the fragging would need to be there for them to enable this good map pool to actually have any effect. Now, coming in, they actually had pretty poor form. Like online, their form has been shit the entire year. They only finished 3rd in the ECS Development League behind Space Soldiers. In ESEA Premier, they finished 8th. They were below Space Soldiers, Penta, Epsilon, Rogue. They were tied with Spirit and Godsend. So terrible team online. So actually, it's not surprising you don't have more activity from them. Why would you invite this team? They haven't got like the hugest fan base. Na'Vi gets most of the CIS fans. They haven't got great online form. They actually hadn't even had any big finishes. They had Dreamer Costin, but that was a tier 2, tier 3 event. And they don't even compete in online qualifiers. So if you don't invite them, they're not even going to try and qualify. They didn't compete in the IEM qualifiers, didn't compete for ESL1 Cologne qualifiers. So they haven't done themselves any favours. And understandably, they were justifiably a bottom half of the top 10 team who had a couple of good results. And so we're fighting for, 8th, 7th, 8th, 9th type spots. They weren't some sleeper pick to win the whole tournament. And people might pretend now like they were extremely good and they just hadn't played enough lands. That's just unrealistic if you look at what happened. I mean, they went to Star Series. They didn't come close to getting out of the Swiss system. Their only ranked best of 3 wins coming into this major were against G2 at G2's second ever tournament, and that was a very narrow victory, and against Immortals at the same tournament, DreamHack Austin, when Immortals still had FNX, they were still having some issues, and they were a decent team, but they were nowhere near a top 5, top 6 team in the world. So then you consider DreamHack Summer was before this tournament, and they were very disappointing. They beat Cloud9 before Cloud9 began their run, so not that crazy a result. And they lost quite convincingly to Fnatic, who themselves were only just getting their shit together. So they weren't a team even with these big results coming into the major. But at the major, yes, they were very impressive. Now, in the Swiss system, I have to say, even though they 3-0, they got a very easy route. They beat Mouse Sports, who I think is a good team, but they're borderline. That was a decent enough result. They beat G2 on Cash, which admittedly Cash has been a map that has been tricky at times for G2, but that's a very legit win. That's a ranked team. And then they beat VP on Train. Admittedly, VP always going to be good on Train. VP hasn't done a lot in a long while, though. So only really one significant win to get into the playoffs. The Mouse one, not a bad one, but the only ranked win was the G2 one there. Now you get into the playoffs and they play Fnatic. Yes, a team on the rise, finally back in the top 10, looking dangerous in terms of fragging, and had beaten Gambit previously in the group stage of DreamHack Summer. So yes, this is already going to be an interesting series in itself. But I laid out in my video where I was doing my predictions why it should be a Gambit 2-0, why the map pool favoured them, and why Fnatic really only had those intangibles of like, it's a major, Gambit hasn't gone deeper than a major into the top 4. Fnatic players have, Fnatic players manage it somehow, Fnatic players have the clutch it factor. None of that really ended up mattering though. I mean, interestingly enough, we started out the series with a very interesting detail, which I think showed the mentality of Gambit going into this major, which is that they didn't get sucked into going and picking Cobble, because Fnatic, that's their permaban. They ban it all the time, but Fnatic didn't ban Cobble, they banned Cash instead. So normally, Cobble's a very good map for Gambit. You'd think, right, Gambit should go ahead and pick Cobble, a map Fnatic has hated since they got this lineup back together, and get the easy win there. But I think Zeus understood his team hasn't been deep at a major before. He's got young and inexperienced players like Mo and Hobbit, and he needs basically to get comfort, to get what he prepared, what his game plan is, and execute that. He's going to win by executing, not by having the better players, in theory at least, going into these matches. So not picking Cobble, and instead sticking with the Train pick, was an intelligent pick overall. Like, this allowed you to stick with the game plan. It's what you prepared. You knew you were going to have the option to go for Train because they were going to ban Cobble, and you'd still pick Train anyway. So you stuck with that, and that ended up being a very close win. So I'm really glad that Gambit didn't gamble for the Cobblestone, because I feel like that's where no one really knows what Fnatic would be like on that map. And I'm sure they had something unique if they were trying to bait the pick out of Gambit. So I feel as though that could have been a potential banana skin and maybe made this a 3-map series. So I'm really glad that Gambit didn't do that. And I think it shows their mentality that these are the maps we're good on. We've prepared. We know we're getting this map, and we're going to stick with this. Because remember, Gambit themselves got baited into that Cobblestone pick at Star Series by CLG. It turned out CLG had prepared for them and managed to get the upset win over them. So I think that's a very notable detail. Then you've got to consider the Overpass game that they played against CLG at DreamHack Summer. Same thing happened again. Baited into the pick, prepared. And so I feel as though they did a good job to avoid that this time around. Then you've got to consider that the Inferno game was very much so convincing because Dossier went ham. That was the one map in the tournament he really went ham. He had a big performance. It's a medium range map. He has always been a medium range player, and I feel like that really big performance ensured they got the win. Adren surprisingly was quiet. I thought he would be better actually, but for whatever reason he just didn't really go off in this particular series. In general, the big shock was that Fnatic didn't really stay with them in fragging. Even when Fnatic haven't made the playoffs in past tournaments, their fragging level's been pretty good, and that's where they're dangerous. In this series, everyone except JW, who's their best player at the moment, actually was kind of lackluster, and nearly the entire Gambit team was out fragging Fnatic. So I feel as though actually this result was a bit skewed. Yes, Fnatic did a good job at trying to bait them. Gambit did a good job avoiding it. Gambit got the maps they wanted, 2 of their best maps right now. All of it was fine, but I do feel like while yes, Adren probably would have shown up more in a normal match if he played again, I feel like it's very unlikely that people like Zeus, etc., frag so well in a series like this when you consider how they did in the rest of this tournament and in the months before. So I think they got a little bit of luck on their side. I think they would have won the series anyway, but I think that they got a little bit worked out in their favour. Then you come to the semi-final, and now they play the best match of the tournament for them. And the toughest opponent of the tournament, Astralis. Top 3 team in the world, top 3, top 4 team in the world, depending on how your rankings go. And at this point in time, the favourite, the overwhelming favourite to win the major, because they've beaten SK and there's no one else out of the top teams available at that point. And Astralis in general doesn't lose to the lesser teams, especially not in best of 3. And Gambit has never beaten a team of the level of Astralis in a best of 3. So this was obviously a 3-map series. It was a 2-1 for Gambit. Now, first and foremost, even though people are going to look at the Train game and address all of Astralis' failures and all the great things that Gambit did, I actually think this series was essentially won by the Overpass game. Because the Overpass game was a convincing win for Gambit on a map that Astralis is godlike on. This version of Astralis on godlike is one of the... This version of Astralis on Overpass is one of the best teams on any map in the history of Counter-Strike. If I was going to make another of those top 20 most dominant maps, Astralis' Overpass would be right in there. It is incredible right now. But this huge CT half from Gambit was able to shut it down, and that was all down to Mo having the game of his life. He has never done it at this level against the elite teams in the last year or so. It just hasn't happened for him. But he had a monster game at the perfect time, which denied Astralis managing to win the map. And he especially out-dueled Device, who at the time was having incredible form. Obviously, he was amazing against SK before. It is the best map for Astralis. If Astralis win that map, even though, yes, I obviously know the score of the next match, I think that would have been Astralis 2-0. And the key thing is, Astralis wouldn't have been in the shaky position they were on Train, because I always thought Inferno was back and forth. Like, that very much could have gone either way, and I think the fragging of Astralis actually meant that I favoured them on Inferno. So, the Overpass one was the big one for me, and Mo really helped with that. Now, the Inferno game was actually kind of a crap game. Astralis didn't even look that good themselves, but they cruised to victory on this one. The guys from Gambit looked really shaken on this one. They looked like actually they didn't have anything for them. But coming into Train, this is the key. Because for the whole series, Adren, Zeus, and Hobbit were all good pretty consistently over the 2 maps that they won, and particularly Zeus on the 3rd map went super fucking ham. First of all, he had a huge fragging performance, because actually, something people might not know about Zeus, but in CSGO, and especially 1.6, he was an in-game leader who led as the entry fragger in an era when they didn't always do that. In fact, famously, he'd sometimes sort of pressure lurk a different part of the map, go first, die, but then make the read from what he saw in the site to tell his team where to go at that point in time. So a bit like Fallen kind of aggressively pushing on the spots with his AWP, not just to kill people, obviously Fallen's much better at killing than Zeus, but to get the info to make the read from, because you're a good in-game leader. So actually, we saw a lot of aggressive play by Zeus, but the key on this map for me, First of all, there was the Astralis mistakes, which I'll get into in a second. That opened the door for Gambit to win this map, but the real key was that timeout. Because that timeout late in their T half, when Astralis really had gotten a good rhythm and a good feel for where to attack early in the round, that actually opened up to Gambit to stop this slow pace, which has always been the classic Gambit style, change up the pace, and crucially, the best player on the map at the time was Dupree for Astralis. He was doing a lot of work in the ladder room, but he always went there. So they double banged him a couple of times in a row, really rushed him hard, and picked up the pace in an uncharacteristic style for Gambit, and that is what allowed them to get the couple of rounds that broke the Astralis defense, which was a little bit shaky in terms of comms, and therefore won the map. And that, for me, yes, the overpass one was the deciding map, the true deciding map for me, but this was kind of the critical moment that won Gambit the major as far as I'm concerned, and a lot of it was on Zeus's individual play, and especially his hero call to switch up the pace and really break Astralis at the key strongest point of the map, which is the key element. They didn't look for the weakest map and just overload that. They actually broke through the strongest part of the defense and therefore were able to overwhelm the site. Also, there'd been lots of inside attacks from Gambit that weren't working that much, so they switched it up, they went to the outer attack, and that with pace, and then Zeus just being a baller, was what enabled them to break Astralis and win this big series. Now on the Astralis side, what helped Gambit win? First of all, poor series overall from Kirby, whose entry fragging has been huge. You look at the poor overpass game they had. Glaive was terrible this series, not only just individually, but I think he had some key misplays. I actually think the key one on Train was that one late in the T half where he fucked up the 1v2 by killing his teammate, and therefore they lost the round. Because I think if they win that round, they can end on something like, I think it would have been like 7 rounds maybe, which makes their CT a little bit easier and means that Gambit would have had to figure out the transition on the CT side maybe a bit earlier, otherwise they might lose the game or go to overtime. So I feel like that was a key play for Astralis in terms of them fucking up. Now when you get to the final, bizarrely, guys from Gambit actually end up playing what I would argue was the worst team they played in the entire tournament. I think Mouse Sports is actually a little bit better than Immortals overall. That one's borderline. I think Fnatic is better actually at the moment. I think if you put them both in big tournaments, I think Fnatic will go further. I think, okay, admittedly, maybe VP not. I guess VP is a little bit worse. Astralis is much better. And I think G2 is a decent amount better than Immortals. So they got to the final. At that point, I was pretty sure they were going to win. With that said, they got smashed on Cobblestone, but they haven't really been playing Cobblestone that much recently, and it has always been an Immortals' strength, and you know how their double ops can get rolling. Plus, you had a shit CT side from Gambit, and CT side is where Gambit always got it going on Cobblestone, as Wallaby Beetle famously pointed out in his article. And you look at it, when their CT side gets bullied, like by CLG at Star Series, like by Immortals here, that's when they struggle. Now on Train and Inferno, the maps that have carried them the whole tournament, they were the better team by far. The Train one, I always thought they were going to beat Immortals on this one. They've got a much better T side. Inferno was the interesting one because Immortals have been streaky on that map, and it feels like a map that suits their streaky style, but still convincing victory overall from the guys from Gambit. So the interesting detail is, in this tournament, they had 5 maps that they played. They didn't play at any point Nuke or, what was the other one? Mirage. They didn't play either. Obviously, they banned Mirage every time, and then Nuke's just a map not many people play in general. They played 5 maps. The only map they had a losing record on was Cobblestone, which was only played in the final against Immortals. They won Cash once against G2. They won Overpass once when they played against Astralis, so those were kind of like sleepers. And then they really did get all of their primary heavy lifting done on Train and Inferno. They went 7-1 on Train and Inferno. Remember, it used to be Cobble and Overpass was like the imbalanced maps that they went over like. So you can see how the map pool really expanded, because these should have been their 3rd and 4th best maps, but now are their best maps. Particularly the Train 4-0 is very impressive, because the key thing is everyone will play Inferno at the moment, but Train's also always available if you are a good enough team on it, and not many teams go to it though as a map. So that's really how they got it done. They went 9-2 in maps over the tournament. Now, first and foremost, yes, they did win primarily because of Train and Inferno, because as I said, everyone will play Inferno, nobody bans Train. But having Cobble and Overpass in the past be so strong, and not having so much activity recently, also meant people didn't know quite how strong they were on Train and Inferno. So as a result, a lot of people got sucked into bans on stuff like Cobblestone, or didn't want to play at Overpass, and therefore it looked like they were getting decent vetoes against Gambit, whereas Gambit was getting everything they wanted every time. They also didn't get sucked into trick picks. There was 2 obvious ones here. One would have been Cobblestone against Fnatic, and 2, I think, would have been picking Cash against Astralis, because Cash has always been a weak map for Astralis. Astralis, and you would have thought at this point in time, with Gambit much improved on that map, they could consider taking this map. But instead, they went with the ballsy Inferno pick, even though Astralis is good on Inferno, perhaps a little bit scared off by Astralis smashing, well, beating SK on cash. That's certainly something to consider about, but I think particularly they were going with their strengths, they were going with the execution start, and they weren't getting sucked into trick picks, where again, Astralis could have watched more of your games than he could have watched of theirs, because Astralis hadn't played that much before playing SK in the round of 8. Now, they won this tournament primarily off T-sides. The improved map pool meant a lot, but winning a lot of their T-sides and always getting a strong amount of rounds is really what allowed Gambit to win this tournament. Now, you look at individual performances and skill, I do think they got more from their players than they can reasonably expect to and have done at past tournaments. Like, Adren was very solid, very strong overall. He had a couple of weak moments in the playoffs, but aside, like the Fnatic series. But all in all, easily their best player for me overall when you look as an all-round player, and rightfully so, the MVP of the tournament. So he already was playing at that level or better earlier in the year, but I feel like the expanded map pool and other players having good performances gave him the platform to show us this MVP level performance, and he will end the year as a potential one of the best players of the year competing for that title. So you got your star performances from Adren. Then you had Hobbit, who again was rock solid. Obviously, he's only played one major. You can never know what people are going to do at majors. But even as he went deep in majors, he just always remained solid. He's really carved out his niche in that team. And his fragging is really underratedly consistent. He just always gets it done. And he seems like a player who just does what he's told. So he had a really solid tournament as well. Mo had just big moments. Like overall as a player, I thought he had an overperformance as an overall tournament, but he still wasn't that godlike in the overall tournament. It's just that he had these couple of big maps that were huge to win this team the tournament. First of all, there was the map against Astralis. Like I said, I think actually got them to the final ultimately. He had the game of his life there. And then in the final, he had a couple of really big maps against the Immortals. Admittedly, not such a sick team. Like, to me, that is just farming tier 2 again. But doing very well against them. And these huge maps added to the MVP performance of Adren and the solid fragging of Hobbit gave them that third player that they don't normally have in Gambit. Now, Dossier, yes, he had his good map against Fnatic, which ensured the 2-0, so you didn't get into a kind of the old squeaky bum territory, as you might say. But aside from that, Dossier was kind of lackluster all in all. Wasn't a big level of fragging, but it's what you normally expect. He played at the normal level he does for this team, except for DreamHack Austin. Zeus actually had fairly underwhelming fragging, as you usually see at most tournaments, but that third map against Astralis, he had a monster performance, and that really helped them get through that series. So interestingly enough, you look at them as players, Mo, Dossier, and Zeus weren't particularly good. Like, Mo wasn't consistent over the whole tournament, and Dozier and Zeus weren't particularly good at fragging, but they still won the tournament anyway. That's because their T-sides were fantastic. Execution, in other words, Zeus's part, really was a big part of what allowed them to win the tournament. The map tool being in a good place, I actually think, should allow them to continue to be strong. They're going to get Train and Inferno against other teams, especially because you still have to be worried about that cobble and about that overpass. Now, I do think of the teams that they beat, in series, the only one that was actually legitimately a top team was Astralis. So overall, you look at where this will place Gambit, yeah, I would just say this makes them a 5th to 6th level team. Then I'm not seeing them as a championship team. I don't think they'll win any big tier 1 titles after this. I think they can be a solid 5th to 6th team and a strong dark horse, but that's about it. They should be a team where if they make the round of 8 of a playoffs, they could win one series or they could give you a tough semi, but they won't make the final. They won't win tournaments. I think Astralis did them a big favour by taking out SK. I think SK's matchup, because the fragging would very much have been on the SK side of things, and the map pool is very interesting because if you try picking Train or Inferno against SK, you're going to have a tough time. I feel as though SK would have been the nightmare that would have knocked them out in the semis and just given them a top 4, which would be a good finish for this sort of a team. So Astralis did them a favour. Then Virtus.pro failing on the other side of the bracket helped, because I feel like in the final, Virtus.pro would have had a lot of the intangibles to stay close and make it really tough for them, and obviously have a lot more familiarity with them than a team like Immortals, I think, overall. I do still see fragging as an issue because I don't think that Mo is someone who himself maintained that performance across the whole tournament. I don't think he's going to go forwards. But particularly, since Zeus and Dossier don't add much frags, yes, they had their couple of maps here, which is what you're going to need if you're an underdog team who wins the championship. I don't think you can expect those very often. So I still see Zeus, Dossier, and Mo as liabilities. I think Adren's very good, and I think Hobbit's a very consistent fragger. So I feel like they're still lacking that third guy to really get them to an elite level. I do want to see them play against the other elite teams, though. I want to see them play against SK Gaming, because when you've got Cash, Cobble, Inferno in the mix there, that's pretty interesting right there as to where we'd end up in terms of we know that they're going to have to ban Mirage against SK. So I feel like SK would be a strong favourite to beat them. I think if FaZe played them, okay, the map's in the mix there. Got Train, Overpass, Inferno. I'm going to have to go ahead and say again, I think FaZe has got a very strong matchup against Gambit. I think FaZe would beat them. And I think G2 is the one where I could see them going back and forth with G2 because you've got Cobble, you've got Overpass, and you've got Cash. I feel like that's great for Gambit. That's really good right there. I feel like for G2, it's still pretty good. They're very good on Cobble and Overpass. But since Gambit has the tactics and G2 has the fragging power, I see that as a classic head versus, well, brains versus brawn matchup. And I think that could go either way. But obviously, I'd gradually lean to the G2 fragging overpower because I feel like Mo's not going to turn up as much against a team like G2. So I feel as though going forwards, congratulations for a fantastic tournament. They really got the best out of everyone. This really was a tournament where it took almost everyone having big moments and better tournaments than usual. They won on the maps that they were prepared on. They won with execution. They won with T-sides. And they broke down all the opponents they played. So congratulations a lot. With that said, I don't see them as a world-class elite team right now.
Hi, this is Gambit and you're watching Thorin's YouTube channel.